The text message hit like a freight train. "Hey, I need to talk to you about something important," it read. But it wasn't from his wife, Laura. It was from his best friend, Ryan. For a moment, Jason stood frozen in his kitchen, the phone trembling in his hand. There was an edge to Ryan's words that Jason didn't recognize, a tone that hinted at something looming, something bad. Jason and Laura had been married for 8 years, a time marked by shared dreams and countless memories. Ryan had been there for most of it, his best friend since college. Jason had trusted him with almost everything, his secrets, his victories, his struggles. Ryan was practically family. And Laura? She'd always liked Ryan, laughing at his jokes and teasing him like a brother. Or so Jason had thought. Ryan hadn't given him much of a choice but to meet up. Later that afternoon, they sat across from each other at a coffee shop. Ryan looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hair disheveled, guilt etched into his face. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush. "Jason, I messed up. I've been seeing Laura." At first, Jason didn't react. It was as though the words hadn't reached him, as though they'd been stopped by some invisible barrier protecting his mind from the unthinkable. Then, he laughed a short, bitter sound. "You're joking." Right? Jason leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Ryan shook his head. "I wish I was. I'm sorry, man. It just happened." "It just happened," Jason's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You're telling me that sleeping with my wife just happened? Like a car accident or slipping on ice?" Ryan flinched but said nothing. Jason stared at him, an icy fury building in his gut. His best friend. The man he'd trusted more than anyone else. How long? Ryan hesitated, and Jason slammed his fist onto the table, making the coffee cups rattle. "How long?" "6 months," Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason sat back, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a boulder. 6 months, he repeated, the words hollow in his mouth. "Jason, I'm ending it. I already told her. I can't do this to you anymore." Jason laughed again, this time colder. "How noble of you. You had your fun, and now you're doing what? Trying to salvage your conscience." Ryan reached across the table, but Jason pulled back like he'd been burned. "Don't," Jason growled. "Don't you dare try to make yourself the victim here. You knew what you were doing every step of the way." Ryan nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. "You're right. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just thought you should know." Jason stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. People in the cafe turned to look, but he didn't care. "You thought I should know? Well, congratulations, Ryan. You've officially destroyed our friendship and my marriage all in one go. Go to hell." He left without looking back. The drive home was a blur. Jason's thoughts spiraled, each one sharper and more painful than the last. He replayed every interaction between Laura and Ryan over the past 6 months, every joke, every smile. How hadn't he seen it? When he arrived home, Laura was in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled, but her expression faltered when she saw his face. "Jason? What's wrong?" "Don't," he snapped, his voice echoing through the room. "Don't you dare pretend like you don't know." Her eyes widened in genuine confusion, but then realization dawned. She set her phone down, her hands trembling. "Jason, I can explain." "Explain," Jason's voice was a roar now. "Explain what, Laura? That you've been screwing my best friend for 6 months? That while I was working late or trusting you both, you were betraying me?" Tears filled her eyes, but Jason didn't care. He paced the room, his anger spilling out in waves. "I trusted you, Laura. I gave you everything. And Ryan? He was like a brother to me. Do you even realize what you've done?" "Jason, please," she begged. It wasn't. It wasn't what he interrupted. It wasn't serious. It wasn't planned. "Don't insult me with excuses, Laura. You destroyed our marriage, and for what? A few cheap thrills behind my back." She broke down, sobbing, but he felt no sympathy. Not now. Not after what he'd just learned. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said through her tears. "Things between us haven't been the same, Jason. You've been distant, focused on work. I felt, I don't know, neglected." Jason froze, her words slicing through him. Neglected, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decided to run to him? To Ryan? You didn't just betray me, Laura. You betrayed everything we built. She reached for him, but he stepped back. Don't, he said coldly. You don't get to play the victim here. I worked my ass off to provide for us, and this is how you repay me. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry doesn't fix this, Jason snapped. Sorry doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal. You made your choice, Laura. Now you'll have to live with it. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Jason spent the night at a hotel, his mind racing. Everything he'd thought he knew about his life had been shattered in a single afternoon. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let Laura or Ryan dictate the terms of how this ended. The next morning, he called his lawyer. Jason stared at the papers spread across the dining table. The divorce paperwork was a stark reality he didn't think he'd be facing so soon. His lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Carl, had been efficient and thorough, leaving no loopholes for Laura to exploit. Jason wanted everything ironclad. No room for negotiation, it was going to be a clean break. Laura had been served 2 days ago. Since then, she'd tried calling him repeatedly, but he hadn't answered. Not once. He didn't want to hear her excuses or apologies. He had nothing to say to her, not yet, anyway. The doorbell rang, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. Jason clenched his jaw, already knowing who it was. He stood, squared his shoulders, and opened the door. There she was, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale. Laura held an envelope in her trembling hands. You didn't need to do it like this, she said, her voice hoarse. Jason leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. How else was I supposed to do it? Sit down and have a cozy little chat about how you destroyed our marriage. Forgive me if I'm not feeling generous. She flinched, but she didn't back down. Please, Jason, let me talk to you. Just for a minute. He stared at her for a long moment before stepping aside. 5 minutes, he said curtly. Laura stepped inside, glancing at the paperwork on the table. Her breath hitched, and Jason saw the way her hands gripped the envelope tighter. She sat down, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. I'm not contesting the divorce, she began, her voice shaky. But I need you to understand. Jason cut her off, slamming his palm onto the table. Understand? You want me to understand why you slept with my best friend for half a year? You don't get to explain this away, Laura. You were never home, she said softly, her tone defensive but pleading. You were always working, always distracted. I didn't feel like I mattered to you anymore. Jason's laughter was bitter, filled with venom. So your solution was to sleep with Ryan? Got it. Thanks for the clarification. That's not fair, Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face. No, what's not fair is me working my ass off for this family while you're sneaking around behind my back. Jason's voice was sharp, his words cutting through her sobs. Do you even realize what you've done? To me. To us. I made a mistake, Laura said, her voice breaking. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store, Jason shot back. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A repeated, deliberate choice. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. But Jason didn't soften. He couldn't. He wouldn't. I want you out of the house, he said, his tone final. Laura looked up, her expression stricken. What? Jason, please. I've already spoken to Carl, Jason continued, cutting her off. You'll have 30 days to move out. After that, I don't care where you go, but you won't be staying here. This is my home too, she said, her voice rising. Not anymore, Jason replied coldly. You lost that right the moment you betrayed me. She opened her mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she slid the envelope across the table. There's something you need to see, she said quietly. Jason eyed it suspiciously before snatching it up. He tore it open, pulling out a stack of photos. His blood ran cold as he flipped through them. They were pictures of Ryan. But he wasn't alone. In the first photo, he was sitting at a bar, his arm draped around a woman who wasn't Laura. In the next, he was kissing her in the parking lot. And the third. Jason couldn't even look at it for more than a second before slamming it down onto the table. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Laura wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I found those a week ago. He doesn't know I have them. I confronted him, and he admitted he'd been seeing her for months. Apparently I wasn't the only one he was cheating with." Jason felt the air leave his lungs as the realization sank in. Ryan hadn't just betrayed him, he'd betrayed Laura too. "So what, you're trying to make yourself the victim now? Is that it?" "No," Laura said quickly. "That's not what I'm saying. I know what I did was wrong, but I thought you should know the kind of person he really is." Jason laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "The kind of person he is? I think I've got a pretty good idea thanks to you." She flinched but didn't argue. Jason tossed the photos back onto the table and stood. "Your 5 minutes are up. Get out." Laura hesitated, her gaze searching his face for any sign of forgiveness. She found none. Slowly, she stood and walked to the door. "I'm sorry, Jason," she said one last time before leaving. Jason locked the door behind her and leaned against it, his mind racing. The photos changed nothing about what Laura had done, but they added another layer to the betrayal. Ryan hadn't just stabbed him in the back, he'd twisted the knife. The next day, Jason confronted Ryan at his office. Ryan's face turned ghostly pale when Jason walked in unannounced, holding the photos. Jason tossed them onto Ryan's desk without a word. Ryan picked them up, his hands shaking. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" Jason replied coldly. "You're a liar and a coward, Ryan. And now, everyone's going to know." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "Jason, wait." No, Jason interrupted, his voice firm. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. You betrayed me, and now you're going to face the consequences." Jason walked out, leaving Ryan to deal with the fallout on his own. By the end of the week, Jason had finalized the divorce terms with Carl. Laura had agreed to everything, including moving out of the house. As for Ryan, word of his indiscretion spread quickly, tarnishing his reputation both personally and professionally. Jason stood in his now quiet home, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. He was free to rebuild his life, free to move forward without the shadows of betrayal hanging over him. Jason stood in the driveway, staring at the moving truck parked outside his house. Laura's things were being loaded into it at a steady pace, the sound of boxes scraping against the metal ramp filling the air. She had hired a moving company to handle it all, sparing them both the awkwardness of having to interact more than necessary. She emerged from the house, holding a small box in her arms. Her eyes flicked to Jason, but he didn't move or acknowledge her. He leaned against his car, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his posture taut, like a coiled spring. "Jason," she said softly, pausing a few feet from him. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the movers as they carried out the last of her belongings. The silence between them was heavy, almost tangible, and it stretched far enough to make her uncomfortable. "Can we at least talk before I go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jason finally looked at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. "What's left to talk about, Laura? You're leaving, exactly like we agreed. I don't see the point." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she quickly shut them again. I wanted to say goodbye," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Goodbye? That's rich. You said goodbye to our marriage the moment you crawled into bed with him." This he gestured to the moving truck. "This is just the paperwork catching up." Laura flinched, her grip tightening on the box she carried. She looked down, avoiding his piercing gaze. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I'm still sorry, Jason." "Sorry," Jason repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "You keep saying that like it's some magic word that erases everything. It doesn't. And I don't want your apologies, Laura. They're meaningless now." He turned his back on her, walking toward the sidewalk, needing the distance to keep his emotions in check. Laura stood frozen for a moment before setting the box down on the ground. She hesitated, then followed him. I know you don't believe me, she said, her voice firmer now, but I did love you, Jason. I still do. Jason stopped, his shoulders stiffening. He turned slowly, his eyes blazing with fury. Love? Don't you dare use that word with me. Love doesn't look like lies and betrayal. Love doesn't involve sneaking around with my best friend. Whatever it is you felt for me, it wasn't love. Laura's eyes filled with tears, but Jason didn't waver. His anger was like a shield, impenetrable and unwavering. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less intense. You know, the worst part isn't even what you did, he said, his tone razor sharp. It's that you looked me in the eye every day and lied. You let me believe we were okay while you were destroying everything behind my back. I didn't plan for it to happen, she said weakly, tears streaming down her face. Spare me, Jason snapped. You don't accidentally cheat, Laura. You made a choice, over and over again, and now you're living with the consequences. So stop pretending you're some victim in all this. She opened her mouth to respond, but one of the movers called out that the truck was ready. Laura glanced over her shoulder, then back at Jason. Her shoulders sagged, and she seemed to deflate under the weight of it all. I'll be out of your life after this, she said quietly. I just hope. She trailed off, shaking her head as if realizing the futility of her words. Jason didn't let her finish. Good, he said bluntly. That's exactly what I want. Laura nodded slowly, her tears falling silently. She turned and walked back to the truck, climbing into the passenger seat without looking back. The engine roared to life, and Jason stood motionless as the truck pulled away, taking her and all the remnants of their shattered life together. The house felt eerily quiet once she was gone. Jason stood in the living room, staring at the empty spaces where her things used to be. It should have felt freeing, but instead, it felt hollow. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. There was no room for sentimentality now. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. Jason frowned, not expecting anyone. When he opened it, Ryan stood there, looking disheveled and nervous. Jason's blood boiled instantly. What the hell are you doing here? Jason barked, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. Jason, I need to talk to you, Ryan said quickly, his words rushed and desperate. We're done talking, Jason snapped. You've already said everything I need to hear, and frankly, I'm not interested in anything else you have to say. Please, just hear me out, Ryan pleaded. I made a mistake. I know I screwed up, but I was dealing with my own crap, and I wasn't thinking straight. I can't lose you, man. You're like a brother to me. Jason's laugh was sharp and humorless. A brother? That's funny, Ryan. 'Cause last time I checked, brothers don't sleep with each other's wives. Ryan flinched but pressed on. I panicked, okay? I was in a bad place, and it just happened. I wasn't trying to hurt you. You weren't trying to hurt me, Jason repeated, his voice rising. Are you seriously standing here, trying to justify what you did? You didn't just hurt me, Ryan. You ruined everything. Our friendship, my marriage, everything. Ryan's face crumpled, but Jason didn't care. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You're a selfish, lying coward, Ryan. And I want you to hear me loud and clear. We are not friends anymore. I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you. And I sure as hell don't want your pathetic excuses. Ryan's shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing in the doorway. Jason watched him go, his chest heaving with the weight of his anger. He closed the door firmly, locking it, as if that could keep the past from creeping back in. By the time the weekend rolled around, Jason felt a sense of finality beginning to settle over him. Laura was gone. Ryan was gone. And though the wounds were still fresh and raw, he knew he'd survived the worst of it. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. His future was his own again, and this time, he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Jason sat at the kitchen counter, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. The house was quieter than it had ever been, the echoes of Laura's absence sinking into every corner. The emptiness was oppressive, but he refused to let it pull him under. He hadn't survived the last few weeks just to fall apart now. The sound of his phone buzzing on the counter drew his attention. He glanced at the screen, his eyebrow twitching when he saw the name. Melissa, Laura's younger sister. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Melissa, he greeted, his voice flat. This isn't exactly a good time. Jason, hear me out, she said quickly. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but this is important. Jason sighed. What is it? I know everything, Melissa said, her voice trembling slightly. About Laura. About Ryan. I told her what she did was disgusting, and I've been trying to stay out of it, but there's something you need to know. Something she didn't tell you. Jason's grip on the phone tightened. If you're calling to make excuses for her, save it. I've heard enough. No, it's not that, Melissa insisted. Jason, she's been lying to you about more than just the affair. There was a long pause as Jason processed her words. What are you talking about? He asked, his tone sharp. Ryan wasn't the first, Melissa said, her voice cracking. There was someone else, before him. Jason's stomach dropped, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. What his voice was low, raw with disbelief. It was someone from her office, Melissa continued hesitantly. It happened last year, but she swore it was over. I only found out because she confided in me when she was feeling guilty. I told her to come clean to you, but she said it wouldn't happen again. I didn't know about Ryan until recently. Jason was silent, his mind racing. The betrayal he'd been dealing with had already felt insurmountable, but this was something else entirely. His jaw tightened, his free hand clenching into a fist on the counter. Who was it? He asked finally, his voice dangerously calm. His name's Greg, Melissa answered. He worked in her department until he transferred out a few months ago. Jason, I didn't know if I should tell you, but you deserve to know everything. Jason's mind was a storm of anger and disbelief. You shouldn't have waited this long, he said coldly. But thanks for finally telling me. Jason, I'm sorry, Melissa said, but he ended the call before she could say more. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. The anger that burned inside him wasn't the searing, uncontrollable kind. It was cold, calculated, and focused. He wasn't going to let this go unanswered. The next morning, Jason was at Laura's workplace before the office opened. He leaned against his car in the parking lot, waiting. The tension in his chest grew with every passing minute, but he kept his expression neutral as employees began to trickle in. Finally, he spotted her. Laura froze as soon as she saw him, her face going pale. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and walked over hesitantly. Jason, she began, her voice wary. What are you doing here? You don't get to ask questions, Jason said coldly. I know about Greg. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. Who told you? Melissa, Jason interrupted. She finally grew a conscience, unlike you. Care to explain? Laura looked around nervously, clearly aware of the growing number of coworkers passing by. She lowered her voice. Can we not do this here? We're doing it now, Jason said firmly. I'm not waiting another second for more of your lies. She sighed, her shoulders sagging. It was a mistake, she admitted quietly. It didn't mean anything. Jason laughed bitterly. You know, you keep saying that, like it's supposed to make me feel better. Like you accidentally tripped and fell into bed with these guys. Laura flinched, her face tightening with frustration. What do you want me to say, Jason? That I was unhappy? That I felt ignored? You weren't there for me. And that justifies what you did, Jason shot back, his voice rising. You didn't even try to fix things, Laura. You went straight to someone else. Twice. I'm not proud of it, she said defensively. But I was lonely, Jason. You don't understand what it was like. No, Jason interrupted sharply. What I don't understand is how I ever thought you were worth my time. You're a liar and a coward, Laura. You don't deserve forgiveness. Not from me, and not from anyone. Her face crumpled, but Jason didn't care. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but no less intense. You've lost everything, Laura. Your husband, your home, your dignity, and you have no one to blame but yourself. Before she could respond, Jason turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, stunned and silent. By the time he got back to his car, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at the screen and saw it was from Melissa. "I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I hope you can move on from her." Jason stared at the message for a moment before typing a quick reply, "Don't contact me again." He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The road stretched out ahead of him, open and endless, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally breathe.